Something has changed. Inside the concrete walls of Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, something fundamental has shifted in the last few weeks. The rules that kept Chris Watts alive. Those rules don't seem to apply anymore. March 2026. It's been over 7 years since Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and baby Nico lost their lives. 7 years since a family was destroyed. 7 years since the world learned what evil looks like when it wears the mask of normalcy. And for most of those 7 years, Christopher Lee Watts has existed in a kind of suspended animation, protected, isolated, watched, kept alive by systems designed to prevent prison violence. But according to multiple sources inside the Wisconsin correctional system, according to leaked documents that have made their way to investigators, according to testimony from people who work behind those walls every single day, something has happened that changes everything. The Aryan Brotherhood has developed a new method, a new approach, a new way of reaching people that protective custody was specifically designed to prevent. And guards can't stop it. What I'm about to share with you comes from months of investigation, from conversations with correctional officers who've asked to remain anonymous, from documents that were never meant to leave the facility, from sources who understand that the public deserves to know what's happening inside our prison system. This isn't speculation. This isn't rumor. This isn't sensationalized true crime content designed to shock you. This is investigative journalism. This is the truth about what's happening right now to Christopher Watts. And more importantly, this is about understanding a prison system that's failing to protect inmates, even when that's its primary mission. But before we go any further, before we dive into the details of what's happening behind those walls, I need us to stop and remember something crucial. This case was never about him. Shanann Watts. Say her name slowly. Shanann. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother who loved her children with everything she had, a woman who worked hard, who built a business, who posted on social media because she was proud of her family and wanted to share her joy with the world. 34 years old when her life was taken from her. 15 weeks pregnant with her third child, a little boy they were going to name Nico. Bella Marie Watts.
4 years old. The big sister, who was smart and observant and loving. A little girl who went to school, who played with her friends, who trusted her father completely, who had her whole life ahead of her. Celeste Catherine Watts. 3 years old, full of energy and light and that particular kind of joy that only young children possess. A little girl who should be 10 years old right now in March 2026. Who should be in elementary school, who should be discovering who she is and what she loves. Nico Lee Watts. Never born, never got to take a single breath, never got to open his eyes, never got to know his mother's love or his sister's laughter. Gone before he could even begin. 4 souls, 4 lives. 4 people who deserved to grow old, to experience everything this world has to offer, to be here with us right now. If you're watching this, if you're listening to this investigation, I want to ask you to do something. Type the word Amen in the comments. Not for him, never for him, but for Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, for Nico, for the Rzucek family, who wakes up every single day carrying a grief most of us cannot even imagine. Frank and Sandra Rzucek, Shanann's parents, grandparents to Bella and Celeste. They've had to bury their daughter and their granddaughters. They've had to live with the knowledge that the man they welcomed into their family, the man they trusted with their daughter's life, destroyed everything they loved. Frankie Rzucek, Shanann's brother, who has become a voice for his sister when she can no longer speak for herself. who has handled this unimaginable tragedy with dignity and grace. Type Amen if you're holding these people in your thoughts, if you're sending them strength, if you're honoring the memories of 4 innocent souls who were taken far too soon. And I'm praying for you too. Yes, you. Because investigations like this, they're heavy. They weigh on your spirit. They can fill you with anger, with sadness, with questions about humanity that are difficult to carry. So I'm asking for protection over everyone who's here right now. That this information doesn't darken your heart, but sharpens your awareness. That it doesn't steal your peace, but strengthens your resolve to recognize danger, to trust your instincts, to protect the people you love. Type Amen if you receive that. Because we're about to go deep into some very dark territory. And we need to go there with the right heart, with respect for the victims, with a commitment to truth, with an understanding that this matters. This really matters. Now, let me be transparent with you about the work that goes into investigations like this.
For years, the strategy for keeping Chris Watts alive has been straightforward. Isolation, protective custody, separation from the general prison population, constant surveillance, heavy guard presence, limited movement, no contact with potentially dangerous inmates. It's a system that's been used for decades to protect high-profile inmates, child offenders, former law enforcement, informants, anyone who faces elevated risk inside prison walls. And for the most part, it works. Not perfectly. Nothing in the prison system works perfectly. But it creates barriers. It makes violence difficult to execute. It gives guards the ability to intervene before situations escalate. But according to my sources, something has changed in the last several weeks that has prison officials deeply concerned. The Aryan Brotherhood has developed what sources are calling a communication protocol that bypasses traditional prison security measures. Now, I need to be careful here. I'm not going to detail exactly how this system works. I'm not going to provide a blueprint that could be replicated in other facilities or that could endanger other inmates or staff. That would be irresponsible journalism. But I can tell you what officials are willing to confirm. The Aryan Brotherhood has found a way to communicate threats, to coordinate actions, and to reach isolated inmates like Chris Watts without ever having direct contact, without triggering the alarms and protocols that protective custody is designed to activate. One source described it to me this way. We used to be able to see the threat coming. We could identify when someone was being targeted because there would be approaches, there would be conversations, there would be visible signs that something was brewing. But this is different. By the time we know what's happening, the message has already been delivered. Oh, think about what that means. Chris Watts is in isolation. He's in a cell by himself. He has minimal contact with other inmates. His movements are monitored. Every interaction is documented. Guards are assigned specifically to watch him. And yet, somehow, the Aryan Brotherhood has gotten to him, has communicated with him, has made it clear that despite all these protective measures, he is not safe. How do we know this? How do we know the messages have been received? According to sources who have observed Chris Watts in recent weeks, his behavior has changed dramatically. He's more anxious, more paranoid. He's stopped eating regular meals. He's having trouble sleeping. He's requested additional security measures. He's asked to be moved to a different facility entirely. These aren't the behaviors of someone who feels protected. These are the behaviors of someone who knows a threat is real and imminent. I'm an investigative reporter. I don't work for a major network.
I don't have a team of producers or unlimited resources or guaranteed access to information. I do this work because it matters, because victims like Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico deserve to have their stories told completely and truthfully, because the public deserves to understand what's really happening inside our institutions.
One correctional officer told me, and I'm paraphrasing here to protect their identity, "I've worked in this system for over 15 years. I've seen scared inmates before, but Watts, there's something different about the way he's scared now. It's not just fear of violence, it's the fear of someone who realizes that all the walls and guards and protocols in the world can't actually protect him from what's coming." That's chilling when you really sit with it. The entire purpose of protective custody is to create safety, to prevent violence, to ensure that even the most hated, most targeted inmates can serve their sentences without being harmed. And what this new development suggests is that the system is failing, not because guards aren't trying, not because officials don't care, but because prison gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood are sophisticated, organized, and patient enough to find ways around even the most stringent security measures. Understanding the Aryan Brotherhood. To understand why this is so significant, we need to talk about who the Aryan Brotherhood is and how they operate. The Aryan Brotherhood, often abbreviated AB, is one of the oldest and most notorious prison gangs in the United States. They were founded in the 1960s in San Quentin State Prison in California, and despite their relatively small numbers, they're considered one of the most violent and influential criminal organizations in the American prison system. Estimates suggest that the Aryan Brotherhood makes up less than 0.1% of the total prison population, but according to the FBI, they're responsible for a disproportionate amount of prison violence and murders. Some reports suggest they're involved in up to 18 to 25% of all prison murders despite their small size. How is that possible? How does such a small organization wield so much power and create so much violence? Organization, discipline, fear, and reach. The Aryan Brotherhood operates in both state and federal prisons across the country. They have an established hierarchy, they have codes of conduct, they have methods of communication that span across facilities, across states, across the entire correctional system. They're patient. They don't need to act immediately. They can wait months, even years, for the right moment to strike. They can coordinate complex operations that involve multiple inmates, multiple facilities, multiple stages. And they're ruthless. Once the AB decides someone is a target, that person's life is in danger for as long as they remain in the system. Relocation doesn't necessarily help. Protective custody doesn't necessarily help, because the AB has connections everywhere. Now, why would the Aryan Brotherhood target Chris Watts specifically?
Several reasons. First, and most significantly, he harmed children. In prison culture, in the hierarchy that exists behind those walls, there's nothing lower than someone who hurt kids. Child predators, child abusers, anyone who caused harm to children, they're considered the worst of the worst. They're targets for violence. They're despised by the general prison population. Chris Watts didn't just harm children, he ended the lives of his own daughters. 4-year-old Bella, 3-year-old Celeste, and his unborn son Nico. In the eyes of many inmates, that makes him especially deserving of whatever violence comes his way. Second, he's famous. His case received massive media attention.
There were documentaries. There were countless news reports. His interrogation videos have been watched millions of times. His name is known far beyond the true crime community. That kind of notoriety creates resentment inside prison. Why does he get all this attention? Why is he considered special enough to warrant protective custody and isolation when other inmates are left to navigate the system on their own? Third, and this might seem small, but it matters in prison culture, he's receiving letters from women, multiple women, women who are romantically interested in him, women who visit him, women who write to him expressing support and even love. To other inmates, especially to members of organizations like the Aryan Brotherhood, this is offensive. This is a man who destroyed his family, receiving affection and attention from the outside world, while they're forgotten. Fourth, he's seen as weak. He's in protective custody. He's isolated. He's not connected to any gang. He has no protection beyond what the guards provide. And in prison, weakness makes you a target. So when the Aryan Brotherhood looks at Chris Watts, they see someone who represents everything they despise. Someone who hurt children, someone who's famous for horrific crimes, someone who's getting attention they don't deserve, someone who's vulnerable. And now, according to my sources, they've decided to do something about it. The failure of protective custody. Let's talk about what protective custody is supposed to do and why it's failing in this case. Protective custody, often called PC, is a form of imprisonment where inmates are kept separate from the general population for their own safety. It's used for inmates who face elevated risk, people who would likely be targeted for violence if they were in general population. In theory, it's a humane system. It acknowledges that some inmates, regardless of what they've done, deserve to be protected from violence while they serve their sentences. It acknowledges that prison should be about serving time for your crimes, not about being subjected to additional punishment from other inmates. In practice, it's complicated.
Protective custody means isolation. It means spending 22 to 23 hours a day in a small cell. It means minimal human contact. It means limited access to programs, education, recreation, all the things that make long-term imprisonment bearable. Studies have shown that extended isolation causes severe psychological damage, depression, anxiety, hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive decline. Some experts compare it to torture. So there's already a question about whether protective custody is humane, even when it's working as intended. But now we're seeing that in cases like Chris Watts, it might not even be accomplishing its primary goal, which is safety. According to sources inside Dodge Correctional, the new communication method the Aryan Brotherhood has developed means that isolation doesn't provide the protection it once did. One source explained it to me this way: "We can keep him physically separated. We can make sure he's never in the same room as AB members. We can monitor his movements, but we can't stop information from flowing. We can't stop messages from being sent. And once those messages reach him, once he knows he's been targeted, the psychological impact is just as damaging as physical violence would be." Oh, that's an important insight. The Aryan Brotherhood doesn't necessarily need to physically harm Chris Watts to accomplish their goal. The threat itself, the knowledge that they can reach him despite all the security measures, that's a form of power. That's a form of violence. He knows they're watching. He knows they've communicated. He knows that despite guards and walls and isolation, he's not actually safe. And he has to live with that knowledge every single day, every hour, every moment, for the rest of his life. Is that justice? Is that appropriate?
Is that what we want our prison system to look like? These are difficult questions without easy answers. On one hand, Chris Watts did something unforgivable. He took 4 innocent lives. He destroyed a family. He traumatized a community. Many people would argue that whatever fear or discomfort he's experiencing now is deserved, that it's karma, that it's a consequence of his actions. On the other hand, we have a legal system that's supposed to be based on the rule of law. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. That's his punishment. He wasn't sentenced to be tortured. He wasn't sentenced to live in constant fear of gang violence. He wasn't sentenced to psychological torment. So when the prison system fails to protect him, when organizations like the Aryan Brotherhood can reach him despite protective custody, are we okay with that? Is that the system we want? I don't have the answer. I genuinely don't. But I think it's important that we ask the question.
What guards are saying. I've spoken with multiple correctional officers who work at facilities that house high-profile inmates like Chris Watts. Most spoke on condition of anonymity because they're not authorized to discuss specific cases or security procedures. But there's a common theme in what they're telling me: frustration, concern, a sense that the system is being overwhelmed by increasingly sophisticated prison gang operations. One officer told me, "We do everything we're supposed to do. We follow protocols. We document everything. We watch these guys constantly. But gangs like the AB, they're always adapting. They find new methods, new ways to communicate, new ways to coordinate, and we're always playing catch-up." Another said, "People on the outside think protective custody means total safety. They think we just lock someone up and that's it, problem solved. But it's not that simple. These organizations have reach, they have patience, they have resources we're only beginning to understand." A third officer, who's worked in corrections for over 20 years, put it this way: "I've seen the system evolve. I've seen gangs become more organized, more strategic, and I've seen our resources stay the same or even decrease. Staffing shortages, budget cuts, overcrowding. We're being asked to do more with less. And inmates like Watts, who need maximum protection, they're the ones who suffer when we can't keep up." There's something deeply troubling about hearing the people who work inside the system express these concerns. These aren't people who are sympathetic to Chris Watts. These aren't people who think he deserves special treatment or leniency. These are professionals who understand that regardless of what someone has done, the prison system has a responsibility to keep people safe while they serve their sentences. And they're telling us that in cases like this, they're not sure they can fulfill that responsibility anymore. One officer shared a specific incident that happened recently, though they couldn't give me exact dates or identifying details. Watts was being moved from his cell to a consultation room for a meeting with his attorney. It's a maximum security route we've taken hundreds of times. Maximum security, guards on both ends, cameras everywhere. And as we're walking, another inmate, someone who shouldn't have even been in that area, walks past us in the opposite direction. Doesn't say anything, doesn't make contact, just walks past. But as he passes, he makes a gesture, subtle, quick, something most people wouldn't even notice. And I saw Watts's reaction. He went pale, started shaking, had to be helped the rest of the way because his legs weren't working properly. Later, I asked the other inmate what the gesture meant. He wouldn't say, just smiled. But Watts knew. And that's when I realized that all our protocols, all our security measures, they don't mean much when the threat can be communicated in a split second with a simple hand gesture.
Oh, that's the reality we're dealing with. The Aryan Brotherhood doesn't need elaborate plots or complex coordination to terrorize someone. A look, A gesture, a brief moment of eye contact. That's all it takes to send a message that says, "We can reach you. We're watching. Your protection doesn't matter." And Chris Watts, he understands that message perfectly. Chris Watts's current state. According to sources who have observed Chris Watts in recent weeks, his mental and emotional state has deteriorated significantly. He's lost weight. He's not eating regular meals. When food is brought to his cell, he often leaves it untouched or barely touches it. He's not sleeping well. Guards conducting nighttime checks have reported seeing him awake at all hours, pacing his cell, sitting on his bunk, staring at nothing. He's more paranoid. He startles easily. He questions guards about security procedures. He asks repeatedly about whether anyone has been asking about him or trying to access information about his location. He's requested additional security measures, wants more frequent cell checks, wants to be moved to a different part of the facility, wants reassurance that certain inmates don't know where he is. And most telling of all, he's requested a transfer to a different facility entirely. According to sources, he's written multiple letters to prison administrators asking to be relocated to a different facility, preferably in a different state. The requests have been denied. Why? Several reasons. First, moving high-profile inmates is complicated. It requires coordination between facilities. It requires approval from multiple levels of administration. It's expensive. It's time-consuming. Second, and more importantly, it might not actually help. The Aryan Brotherhood has connections in facilities across the country. Moving Chris Watts to a different prison doesn't necessarily mean moving him away from AB influence. It just means adjusting where he's located within a system that the AB has already infiltrated. Third, prison officials are reluctant to appear as though they are responding to gang pressure. If they move Watts every time the AB makes a threat, it sets a precedent. It shows that threats work. It gives gang organizations power over administrative decisions. So Watts stays where he is, in his 6x9 cell, with guards who are trying their best to keep him safe, with security measures that used to feel adequate but don't anymore. And he's terrified.
Now, I want to be very careful about how we discuss his emotional state, because I know some of you are thinking, good, he should be terrified. He should feel fear. He should understand what it's like to be helpless and vulnerable and at the mercy of someone more powerful. Bella felt that. Celeste felt that. Shanann felt that. So why should we care that Chris Watts is scared? That's a fair question. It's a question I've wrestled with throughout this investigation. And here's what I've come to. We can acknowledge that his fear is a consequence of his own actions. We can recognize that he created this situation by doing something so horrific that it made him one of the most hated men in the American prison system. We can understand that many people see his current state as justice or karma or appropriate suffering. And at the same time, we can ask questions about what kind of prison system we want to have. Whether we want a system where gang organizations have the power to terrorize inmates regardless of security measures. Whether we're comfortable with psychological torture as an unofficial addition to legal sentences. These things can both be true. His fear can be a consequence of his choices, and the system's failure to protect him can still be concerning from a broader perspective. The letters, a deeper look.
Let's talk about something that's particularly disturbing, and that factors into why the Aryan Brotherhood has intensified their focus on Chris Watts. The letters. The women who write to him. The visitors he receives. This phenomenon, known as hybristophilia, is the attraction some people feel toward individuals who committed serious crimes. It happens with serial offenders, with notorious criminals, with people whose names become synonymous with terrible acts. But knowing the psychology behind it doesn't make it any less troubling. According to sources, Chris Watts receives regular correspondence from multiple women. These aren't letters condemning him. These aren't letters from people seeking answers or closure. These are romantic letters. Letters expressing affection. Letters saying they see good in him. Letters offering support and understanding. And he writes back. Now, prison officials monitor this correspondence. All mail coming in and going out is screened. But unless letters contain specific threats or plans for illegal activity, inmates have a right to send and receive mail. It's considered part of maintaining connections to the outside world, which is important for rehabilitation and mental health. But in Chris Watts's case, this correspondence has become a problem for several reasons.
First, it creates resentment among other inmates. They see him receiving letters, receiving visitors, receiving attention from women who are interested in him romantically. Meanwhile, many of them receive nothing. No letters, no visitors, no one on the outside who cares whether they live or die. That resentment builds. It creates animosity. It makes Watts a target, not just because of what he did, but because of what he has that others don't. Second, the Aryan Brotherhood sees this as particularly offensive. Here's a man who destroyed his own family, who ended the lives of his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters, and he's receiving love letters? He's being pursued romantically? He's getting the kind of attention that suggests some people don't see him as the monster he is. To the AB, that's wrong. That's something that needs to be corrected. Third, and this is where the new method becomes relevant, every letter, every visitor, every interaction with the outside world is information. It's data about who Watts is in contact with, what he's communicating, what his state of mind is. And prison gangs are very good at gathering and using information. One source told me, these organizations, they're watching everything. They know who writes to him. They know when he gets visitors. They know when his mood changes. They're building a complete picture of his life, and they're using that information to maximize psychological impact. Think about that. The very things that might make prison bearable, the connections to the outside world, the letters from people who offer some form of human contact, even if it's misguided, those things are being weaponized against him. The AB can time their threats to coincide with visits. They can reference specific letters. They can demonstrate that they know everything about his life, that his isolation isn't actually isolating him from their reach. And Chris Watts, who spent years manipulating others, who carefully crafted an image of himself as a good father and loving husband while planning to destroy his family, he now finds himself on the receiving end of manipulation from people who are far more skilled at it than he ever was. There's something almost poetic about that, almost like justice, but it's also deeply disturbing from a systemic perspective. The women who visit, a case study. I want to focus on one specific aspect of this situation because I think it reveals something important about human psychology and about how we process extreme crime. Several women have actually traveled to Dodge Correctional Institution to visit Chris Watts in person. They've gone through the visitor application process. They've been approved. They've made the trip to Wisconsin. They've sat across from him in a visitation room. I've tried to understand this. I've read research on hybristophilia. I've listened to psychologists explain the phenomenon. I've tried to approach it without judgment. But I have to be honest. It's difficult. These women know what he did. They know he strangled Shanann. They know he smothered Bella and Celeste. They know he disposed of their bodies in oil tanks. They know he went on television begging for their safe return when he knew they were already gone. They know all of this, and they're still drawn to him. Some of these women have written publicly about their interest in Watts. They talk about seeing something deeper in him, about believing there's more to the story than what was reported, about thinking he's been unfairly judged or misunderstood. One woman reportedly wrote that she believes Chris was abusive and controlling, and that Chris was driven to desperation. This despite the fact that all evidence, all testimony, all investigation showed that Shanann was a victim, not an abuser. Another reportedly wrote that she believes Chris is a good person who made a terrible mistake. A mistake? As if accidentally harming someone is the same as deliberately, premeditatedly ending 4 lives? These rationalizations, they're disturbing because they minimize what happened. They center Chris Watts's experience instead of his victims. They create narratives where he's somehow sympathetic despite overwhelming evidence of who he really is. And the Aryan Brotherhood is watching all of this. They see these women coming to visit. They see the letters. They see the attention. And it reinforces their view that Chris Watts is getting something he doesn't deserve, that he's being treated as special, that he needs to be reminded of who he really is and where he really stands. One correctional officer told me, every time he gets a visitor, every time another letter arrives, it's like adding fuel to a fire. The resentment builds, the determination to send a message intensifies. Those visits that might seem like they're giving him comfort, they're actually making him less safe. Oh, what a terrible irony. The few connections to the outside world that he has, the few moments of human contact that break up the monotony of isolation, they're actually increasing the danger he faces. The system's dilemma. This brings us to a fundamental dilemma that prison officials are facing. How do you protect someone when the very act of protecting them makes them a bigger target?
Protective custody isolates Chris Watts, which is meant to keep him safe. But that isolation also marks him as someone who needs protection, which signals to the general population and to gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood that he's vulnerable, that he's worth targeting. Allowing him to receive letters and visitors maintains his connection to the outside world, which is considered important for mental health. But those connections create resentment and provide information that can be used against him. Moving him to different facilities might temporarily disrupt gang operations, but it also shows that threats are effective and it doesn't solve the underlying problem, that the AB has reach wherever he goes. Increasing security measures around him demonstrates that officials take the threat seriously, but it also draws attention to him, makes him stand out even more, reinforces his status as someone significant enough to warrant special measures. Every option has drawbacks. Every decision creates new vulnerabilities.
This is what one prison administrator described to me as the protective custody paradox. The more you do to protect someone, the more you potentially endanger them, because you're marking them as different, as special, as someone whose safety is a priority in a system where most inmates don't receive that level of concern. And in a hierarchical environment like prison, where respect and status are crucial, being marked as someone who needs extra protection is dangerous. So what's the answer? How should officials handle this situation? I don't know. I've asked that question to everyone I've interviewed, and no one has given me a satisfying answer. Some believe Watts should be moved to a supermax facility with even more stringent security. Others think he should be transferred to federal custody. Some argue that he should be allowed to mix more with general population because isolation is causing more harm than good. Others maintain that isolation is the only thing keeping him alive. There's no consensus. There's no clear path forward. And in the meantime, Chris Watts sits in his cell, knowing that despite all the guards and protocols and security measures, the Aryan Brotherhood has found a way to reach him. What this means for the broader system. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about what this case reveals about the American prison system more broadly. We have over 2 million people incarcerated in the United States, the highest incarceration rate in the world. And within that massive population, there are thousands of inmates in protective custody for various reasons. When the AB targets someone like Chris Watts, it's not just about one individual. It's about demonstrating their reach, about showing other inmates that protective custody doesn't mean safety, about reminding everyone inside those walls that the AB has power that transcends official security measures. Every threat they make, every message they send, every time they find a way to reach someone who's supposed to be unreachable, it reinforces their status, it builds their reputation, it increases the fear and respect that allows them to maintain control. And here's what makes this particularly challenging from a prison management perspective. The AB doesn't need to actually follow through on every threat to maintain power. The threat itself is often enough. If Chris Watts spends every day in fear, if he can't eat or sleep, if his mental health deteriorates, the AB has accomplished their goal without ever laying a hand on him. They've demonstrated power, they've inflicted suffering, they've sent a message to everyone watching. That's a sophisticated form of control. And it's very difficult for prison officials to combat. Because how do you protect someone from fear? How do you prevent psychological harm when the threat is communicated through methods you can barely detect? You can monitor physical interactions, you can search cells, you can control movement, but you can't stop a look, a gesture, a whispered word that carries meaning only to the person it's directed at. One correctional psychologist I spoke with explained it this way. We're dealing with a form of warfare that's happening in plain sight, but that's almost invisible to the official system. And the inmates who are targets, they know exactly what's happening, but they often can't articulate it in a way that allows us to intervene effectively. That's the situation Chris Watts is in right now. He knows he's been threatened. He knows the Aryan Brotherhood is watching him. He knows that his protective custody isn't providing the protection it's supposed to. But what can he tell officials that would allow them to do anything different? Someone made a gesture as they walked past me. I heard someone say something that I interpreted as a threat. I feel like I'm being watched. These things are real. They're genuinely threatening, but they're also difficult to document, difficult to prove, difficult to use as justification for increased security measures that are already at near maximum levels. The letters leaked, what they reveal. Earlier, I mentioned that letters written by Chris Watts have been leaked to various sources.
Some have been published in part by true crime researchers and journalists. Some have been shared privately among people following the case.
Former law enforcement, informants, high-profile cases, people who've harmed children, gang members who've turned against their organizations, people who face credible threats to their safety. If the system can't adequately protect someone as high-profile as Chris Watts, someone whose case has received national attention, someone whose safety is presumably a priority, what does that say about the system's ability to protect lower-profile inmates who face similar threats? The answer is sobering. Many of those inmates are probably even more vulnerable than Watts because they don't have the benefit of media attention, because their cases don't create public accountability, because no one is watching to see whether they're kept safe. This is a systemic problem. It's not unique to Dodge Correctional Institution. It's not unique to Wisconsin. It's a problem that exists across the entire American correctional system. Prison gangs are organized, they're sophisticated, they're patient, they have networks that span facilities, states, even the divide between state and federal systems. And our approach to managing this threat it's reactive. We respond to incidents after they happen. We implement new security measures after breaches occur. We're always one step behind. Meanwhile, staffing shortages continue. Correctional officers are overworked and underpaid. Budgets are tight. Facilities are overcrowded. The resources needed to truly maintain safety are often lacking. One former prison administrator I spoke with put it bluntly, "We're managing human warehouses. We're not rehabilitating. We're not providing meaningful programs. We're not addressing the conditions that allow gang violence to flourish. We're just trying to keep people alive until their sentences are served. And even at that basic level, we're failing too often." That's a harsh assessment, but based on my research, based on the conversations I've had, based on the evidence of cases like Chris Watts, I think it's accurate. We've built a system that's fundamentally about punishment and containment, and we're now dealing with the consequences of that choice. Consequences that include powerful gang organizations that thrive in environments where legitimate authority is weak, where resources are scarce, where violence is common. Prison gangs and power dynamics. To really understand what's happening with Chris Watts, we need to understand how prison gangs maintain power and influence. The Aryan Brotherhood, like other prison gangs, operates through a combination of violence, fear, and what sociologists call informal social control. They can't rely on legal authority. They can't call the police or file lawsuits or use the court system. Their power comes from their willingness to use violence and from the reputation that willingness creates. But it's not just about random acts of violence. It's strategic. It's calculated. It's about sending messages.
These letters, they're revealing in ways that are deeply disturbing. Because what they show is that even now, even 7 years later, even facing threats from one of the most dangerous prison gangs in America, Chris Watts still doesn't truly grasp the magnitude of what he did. He writes about his daily routine, about the books he's reading, about how he's trying to stay positive, about the challenges of prison life. He writes about being misunderstood, about how people judge him without knowing the full story, about how difficult it is to be so isolated and alone. He writes to these women who correspond with him, and he presents himself as someone who made terrible mistakes, but who is still fundamentally a good person who deserves compassion and understanding. What he doesn't write about, what's almost never mentioned, is genuine remorse for his victims. He doesn't write, "I think about Shanann every day and the guilt is unbearable." He doesn't write, "I hear Bella's voice asking if the same thing will happen to her and I want to die from the shame."
He doesn't write, "I destroyed my family and there's no punishment severe enough for what I deserve." Instead, he writes about how hard prison is, how scared he is, how alone he feels, how people don't understand him. It's all focused on his experience, his suffering, his needs. This is what psychologists call instrumental remorse or selective remorse. He's not sorry for what he did to them. He's sorry for what happened to him because of what he did. Do you see the difference? It's crucial. True remorse centers the harm done to victims. It acknowledges that their suffering is the tragedy, not the perpetrator's consequences. Instrumental remorse centers the perpetrator's discomfort. It focuses on punishment being unfair or too harsh or not what they deserve. And in every leaked letter I've reviewed, every excerpt I've read, Chris Watts demonstrates instrumental remorse at best. One source shared an excerpt with me where Watts wrote something to the effect of, "People don't understand the pressure I was under, the stress, the feeling of being trapped with no way out. I made terrible decisions, but I was in a terrible mental place." Let's unpack that for a moment. The pressure I was under? What pressure? Financial stress that millions of families face without resorting to violence? Marriage problems that people work through or end through divorce?
They've also talked about their frustration with the women who write to Chris Watts, about how painful it is to see people express sympathy for the man who destroyed their family while seemingly forgetting about Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. In one interview, Frank said something that has stayed with me. He said, "Those women don't know him. They think they do, but they don't. He showed us who he was on August 13th, 2018. Everything before that was a lie. Everything after that has been manipulation. They're falling for the same act Shanann fell for. The difference is they're doing it with full knowledge of what he's capable of." That's a powerful observation. These women corresponding with Chris Watts, they know what he did. They've seen the evidence, they've heard the confession, they've watched the documentaries, and they're still choosing to engage with him, to offer him affection, to see him as somehow worthy of their time and emotional energy. Meanwhile, the Rzuceks are trying to keep the memory of their daughter and grandchildren alive. They've established a foundation. They speak at events about domestic violence awareness. They work to ensure that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste are remembered for who they were, not just for how they died. Frankie Rzucek, Shanann's brother, has been particularly active on social media. He posts memories of his sister. He shares photos of his nieces. He responds to people who make insensitive comments or who express support for Chris Watts. It can't be easy. It has to be exhausting and painful to constantly advocate for your murdered family members while watching the person who killed them receive sympathy from strangers. But they keep doing it because someone has to speak for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Someone has to keep their memory alive. Someone has to make sure the world doesn't forget who the real victims are. Cindy Watts, the mother's perspective. We also need to talk about Chris Watts's mother, Cindy Watts, because her role in this case is, it's complicated and controversial. After Chris was arrested and confessed, most people expected his family to distance themselves from him, to condemn what he did, to acknowledge that he was guilty and that his victims deserved justice. But that's not what happened. Cindy Watts has continued to support her son. She's visited him in prison. She's written letters defending him. She's made statements suggesting that Shanann was at fault, that she was controlling, that she somehow contributed to what happened. Even after Chris confessed, even after all the evidence was presented, even after he admitted in detail what he did to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste,
his mother still blames Shanann. In interviews and in statements that have been shared publicly, Cindy Watts has suggested that Shanann kept Chris away from his family, that she was manipulative, that she created problems in the marriage. Even if all of that were true, and there's no evidence that it is, it wouldn't justify what Chris did. It wouldn't make him any less responsible for choosing to end 4 lives. But Cindy Watts seems unable or unwilling to acknowledge that her son is a family annihilator, that he's a murderer, that he's where he belongs. This has created additional pain for the Rzucek family. It's one thing to lose your daughter and grandchildren to violence. It's another thing entirely to have the perpetrator's family suggest that your daughter somehow deserved it or caused it. Now, with the Aryan Brotherhood targeting Chris Watts, with the threats intensifying, with his safety in question, one has to wonder what Cindy Watts is thinking and feeling. Does she understand that this is a consequence of what her son did? That people hate him because he did something hateful? That he's in danger because he harmed the most vulnerable people in his life? Or does she still see him as the victim, as someone who's being unfairly persecuted? I don't know. She hasn't made recent public statements about the current situation, but based on her past pattern of defending him regardless of the evidence, I suspect she's still standing by him. And that's difficult to comprehend for those of us who can see clearly what he is and what he did. Maternal love is powerful. The bond between a mother and child is one of the strongest human connections. But at what point does that love become enabling? At what point does support become denial? At what point does defending your child mean dishonoring their victims? These are questions the Watts family has to grapple with, and they're questions that anyone who's loved someone who did something terrible has to confront. The broader question of karma. A lot of people following this case have used the word karma to describe what's happening to Chris Watts now. The idea that what you put into the universe comes back to you, that justice, whether legal or cosmic, eventually finds you, that bad actions lead to bad consequences. Is this karma? Is Chris Watts getting what he deserves? I've thought about this question a lot throughout this investigation, and I think the answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no.
On one hand, yes, there's a kind of poetic justice to the situation. He destroyed his family. He took away their safety, their security, their lives. And now he lives without safety or security. He lives in fear. He lives knowing that at any moment, despite all the protections in place, something terrible could happen to him. He made Bella and Celeste feel afraid in their last moments, and now he feels afraid every moment. He took away Shanann's future, her plans, her hopes, and now he has no future beyond concrete walls and isolation. There's symmetry there. There's a sense that the universe is balanced, that he's experiencing a fraction of the fear and hopelessness his victims experienced. But on the other hand, I'm not sure karma is the right framework. Because karma implies some kind of cosmic system of justice. It implies that the universe is organized in a way that ensures bad people suffer and good people are rewarded. And that's not borne out by reality. Good people suffer all the time. Innocent people face violence and tragedy and pain they don't deserve. The universe doesn't seem to operate on a system of moral accounting. Shanann was a good person. She loved her family, she worked hard, she was kind to others, and she suffered terribly. Where was karma for her? Bella and Celeste were innocent children. They hadn't done anything wrong, they hadn't hurt anyone, and they were terrorized and killed by someone they trusted completely. Where was karma for them? So if we're going to invoke karma when Chris Watts faces consequences, we have to acknowledge that karma didn't protect his victims.
that whatever cosmic justice we believe in, it failed them completely. What's happening to Chris Watts now isn't karma, it's consequence. It's the predictable result of being a family annihilator in a prison system where harming children makes you a target. It's the outcome of being notorious in an environment where notoriety creates resentment. It's what happens when you're vulnerable in a place where vulnerability is exploited. There's no mystical force at work here, just human systems, human hierarchies, human violence responding to what he did. And calling it karma, while emotionally satisfying, risks minimizing the very real systemic problems I've been discussing. The failure of protective custody, the power of prison gangs, the inadequacy of our correctional system. Those problems exist regardless of whether Chris Watts deserves what's happening to him. And they affect other inmates who are in protective custody for reasons that have nothing to do with family annihilation. So yes, I understand why people see this as karma. I understand the emotional resonance of that interpretation.
But I think we need to be more precise. This is consequence. This is the prison system functioning exactly as it's designed to function, for better or worse. This is what happens when you're in maximum security as someone who hurt children. And the question we should be asking isn't whether Chris Watts deserves this. The question is whether this is the system we want to have, whether we're comfortable with prison gangs having this much power, whether we believe protective custody should actually protect people, or whether we're okay with it being performative. Those are harder questions than, is this karma? But they're the questions that actually matter from a policy and ethical perspective. What could have prevented this? Let's talk about prevention. Not just preventing the threats Chris Watts currently faces, but preventing the tragedy that led to him being in prison in the first place. Because that's ultimately what matters most. 4 people died. 4 people who should be alive right now. And while we can't change what happened, we can ask whether there were intervention points that were missed. Were there warning signs? Absolutely. Chris Watts was having an affair. He was emotionally distant from Shanann. He was showing less interest in his children. He was making changes to his appearance. He was being secretive about his phone and his whereabouts. Shanann noticed. Her text messages to friends show that she knew something was wrong. She was worried about her marriage. She was trying to figure out what had changed and how to fix it. Her friends noticed. They saw that Chris seemed different, that he seemed cold, that something felt off about the way he was interacting with his family. Even people at his work noticed changes in his behavior and demeanor. So the signs were there. The question is whether those signs were enough to predict what he was capable of, and more importantly, whether there was any system in place that could have intervened. The answer to the first question is probably not. Most people who have affairs don't kill their families. Most people who go through marriage problems don't resort to violence. The signs Chris showed were concerning, but they weren't specific enough to predict family annihilation. Emotional distance, personality changes, an affair, these things suggest a marriage in trouble. They don't necessarily suggest that someone is planning to commit multiple murders. The answer to the second question is more complex. We don't have good systems for identifying and intervening with potential family annihilators before they act. We don't have mechanisms to mandate mental health evaluation for someone who hasn't committed a crime or made a specific threat. We don't have mechanisms to protect potential victims when the warning signs are subtle. Shanann could have left. She could have filed for divorce. She could have taken the children and moved in with her parents. But why should she have had to? She had no reason to believe her husband was planning to kill her. Difficult marriage, yes. Violence, no. And leaving might not have helped anyway.
Some family annihilators kill their families precisely because they're trying to leave, because the loss of control, the end of the family unit, the public knowledge that their marriage failed, all of that triggers the violence. So the prevention question is difficult, maybe impossible. But there are things we can learn, things that might help in other situations, things that could potentially save lives. First, we need to take emotional abuse and controlling behavior seriously, even when there's no physical violence. Chris Watts wasn't physically abusive to Shanann before he killed her, but he was emotionally manipulative. He was deceptive. He was creating a false reality where everything seemed fine, while he was planning to destroy their family. That kind of behavior is a red flag. It might not predict murder, but it predicts harm. Second, we need to believe people when they say something feels wrong. Shanann told friends she was worried. She sensed something was off. But what could anyone do with that information? She wasn't in immediate danger that anyone could identify. She wasn't being threatened. But her instincts were correct. Something was very wrong. And maybe if we had better systems for responding to those instincts, systems that didn't require proof of imminent harm before taking action, maybe intervention would have been possible. Third, we need better public education about what family annihilation looks like, about the warning signs, about the patterns. Most people think of domestic violence as escalating physical abuse, pushing, hitting, choking, behavior that gets progressively worse until it culminates in murder. But family annihilators often don't follow that pattern. They're often not physically abusive before they kill. They're emotionally detached, they're secretive, they're living double lives. They see their families as obstacles to overcome rather than people to harm in anger. Understanding those patterns, recognizing those signs, might not prevent every tragedy, but it might prevent some. And fourth, we need to address the cultural factors that make family annihilation possible. The idea that men own their families, that children are possessions rather than independent human beings, that divorce is failure, that walking away from a marriage is shameful.
Chris Watts couldn't imagine leaving his family through normal, legal means. He couldn't picture himself as a divorced father paying child support and sharing custody. He couldn't accept that his life would change in ways he didn't want. So instead, he destroyed them. That mindset, that sense of ownership over his family's existence, that's cultural, and it's something we need to challenge and change. The death penalty question. Wisconsin doesn't have the death penalty. It was abolished in 1853, so Chris Watts was never going to face execution for what he did. But the question still comes up regularly. Should he have been sentenced to death? Would that have been more just than life in prison without parole? It's a question people have strong feelings about, and I want to address it carefully because it touches on deep values about justice, punishment, mercy, and what we believe the purpose of our legal system should be. Arguments for the death penalty in this case. He ended 4 lives, 4 innocent people, his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters and his unborn son. The harm he caused is so extreme, so unforgivable, that execution seems proportionate. He planned it. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a situation that spiraled out of control. He made deliberate choices over time to kill his family. He showed no mercy. Bella begged. She asked if the same thing was going to happen to her as happened to Celeste. She knew what was coming, and she begged her father to stop, and he didn't. If he showed no mercy, why should he receive it? The cost. Life in prison means decades of taxpayer money spent on housing, feeding, and protecting him. Execution would be final and would free up those resources. Arguments against the death penalty. The legal system isn't infallible. While there's no question of Chris Watts' guilt, the death penalty has been applied to innocent people. Maintaining the death penalty in any case requires accepting that risk. Life in prison is arguably worse. Death is final, it's over. Life in prison means waking up every day for decades knowing you'll never be free, never experience normal life again, never have privacy or autonomy or joy. That's potentially more punishing than execution. Execution makes him a martyr. Some people would sympathize with him more if he were executed. They'd focus on the state taking his life rather than on the lives he took. Life in prison keeps the focus where it belongs.
Chris Watts couldn't imagine leaving his family through normal, legal means. He couldn't picture himself as a divorced father, paying child support and sharing custody. He couldn't accept that his life would change in ways he didn't want. So instead, he destroyed them. That mindset, that sense of ownership over his family's existence, that's cultural, and it's something we need to challenge and change. The death penalty question. Wisconsin doesn't have the death penalty. It was abolished in 1853, so Chris Watts was never going to face execution for what he did. But the question still comes up regularly. Should he have been sentenced to death? Would that have been more just than life in prison without parole? It's a question people have strong feelings about, and I want to address it carefully because it touches on deep values about justice, punishment, mercy, and what we believe the purpose of our legal system should be. Arguments for the death penalty in this case. He ended 4 lives, 4 innocent people, his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters and his unborn son. The harm he caused is so extreme, so unforgivable, that execution seems proportionate. He planned it. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a situation that spiraled out of control. He made deliberate choices over time to kill his family. He showed no mercy. Bella begged. She asked if the same thing was going to happen to her as happened to Celeste. She knew what was coming, and she begged her father to stop, and he didn't. If he showed no mercy, why should he receive it? The cost. Life in prison means decades of taxpayer money spent on housing, feeding, and protecting him. Execution would be final and would free up those resources. Arguments against the death penalty. The legal system isn't infallible. While there's no question of Chris Watts' guilt, the death penalty has been applied to innocent people. Maintaining the death penalty in any case requires accepting that risk. Life in prison is arguably worse. Death is final, it's over. Life in prison means waking up every day for decades knowing you'll never be free, never experience normal life again, never have privacy or autonomy or joy. That's potentially more punishing than execution. Execution makes him a martyr. Some people would sympathize with him more if he were executed. They'd focus on the state taking his life rather than on the lives he took. Life in prison keeps the focus where it belongs.
Moral consistency. If we believe killing is wrong, if we believe that's the fundamental crime Chris Watts committed, then having the state kill him seems morally inconsistent. Cost. Contrary to popular belief, death penalty cases are actually more expensive than life in prison cases when you factor in the costs of appeals, additional trials, and the heightened legal standards required. I don't have a definitive answer to this question. I can see merit in both positions.
What I do know is that Chris Watts is currently serving 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 84 years. He will die in prison. That's certain. Whether that's sufficient justice for what he did, whether execution would have been more appropriate, those are questions each person has to answer based on their own values and beliefs about punishment and justice. Comparing to other cases. It's worth looking at how the Chris Watts case compares to other family annihilation cases, because while each tragedy is unique, there are patterns that emerge. Family annihilation is more common than most people realize. Research suggests it happens approximately once every 5 days in the United States. Most cases don't receive national attention. They're local news stories, tragedies that devastate communities but don't become part of the broader cultural conversation. What made the Watts case different? Why did this one capture national and even international attention in ways that other similar cases didn't? Several factors. Shanann's social media presence. She documented her life. She posted videos. She shared her family openly. So when she went missing, there was already a digital record of who she was, what her family looked like, how they interacted. It made the tragedy more immediate, more personal. Chris's television appearance, when he went on the porch and did that interview with news media, begging for his family's safe return, people watched. They saw him. They heard him. And later, when his guilt was revealed, they could go back and re-watch that interview knowing he was lying. The contrast between his performance and the reality was stark. The interrogation footage. The full interrogation was released and widely viewed. People could watch the entire process of Chris being confronted, lying, gradually breaking down, and eventually confessing. That kind of access is rare. It allowed people to witness the psychology of a family annihilator in real time. The details. The oil tanks, the fact that Bella witnessed what happened to Celeste and knew what was coming. These details are horrific, and they stuck with people in ways that more generic descriptions of violence might not have.
The apparent normalcy. Chris Watts didn't look like a monster. He looked like every other suburban dad. He seemed nice, calm, unremarkable. That ordinariness made the horror more frightening because it suggested that danger could be anywhere, in anyone. So the Watts case became a cultural phenomenon in a way that most family annihilations don't. But in terms of the crime itself, the psychology behind it, the outcome, it's actually fairly typical of this type of offense. Most family annihilators are men. Most kill their partners and children. Most are motivated by a combination of narcissism, a desire for a new life free of family obligations, and an inability to accept the consequences of divorce. Chris Watts fits that profile exactly. What's different about his current situation is the level of attention it's receiving. Most family annihilators serve their time in relative obscurity. The public moves on. The media stops covering the story. They become just another inmate in the system. Chris Watts hasn't had that luxury. He remains in the public eye, and that continued attention is part of what makes him a target for organizations like the Aryan Brotherhood. The psychology of family annihilation. Let's talk about the psychology that leads someone to annihilate their own family. Because understanding this, while it won't excuse what Chris Watts did, might help us identify and potentially prevent future tragedies. Family annihilators generally fall into several categories, though there's overlap. The self-righteous killer. This type sees the family as having failed them somehow. They feel justified in the killing because the family didn't meet their expectations or caused them problems. They often kill the family and then themselves because they see death as preferable to the shame of divorce or financial ruin. The disappointed killer. Similar to the self-righteous type, but the motivation is more about loss of status. They've lost a job, face financial collapse, or some other major failure. Rather than face that failure publicly, they kill their family to spare them the consequences and then often kill themselves. The anomic killer. This type kills because they've lost control or are losing control. Divorce, custody disputes, the partner leaving. They see killing the family as a way to regain control or to punish the partner for leaving. Chris Watts doesn't fit neatly into any one category, but he's closest to the anomic type with elements of self-righteousness.
He was losing control. Shanann was becoming suspicious. His affair was becoming harder to hide. His double life was unsustainable. And rather than accept the consequences, divorce, shared custody, financial obligations, he chose to eliminate the problem. But he didn't kill himself afterward, which is common in family annihilations. About 40 to 50% of family annihilators commit suicide after killing their families. Chris didn't. He tried to get away with it. He lied to police. He went on television. He played the worried husband and father. That makes him slightly unusual. Most family annihilators who survive the event confess relatively quickly. They're caught at the scene or shortly after. They don't typically have the level of premeditation and attempted cover-up that Chris demonstrated. From a psychological standpoint, what does this tell us? It suggests a particularly deep level of narcissism. Chris didn't just want to be free of his family. He wanted to be free of them while maintaining his image as a good person. He wanted the benefits of their deaths without the social consequences of being known as someone who abandoned his family. It suggests a profound lack of empathy. He could look at his daughters, people he'd raised from birth, and see them as obstacles rather than as human beings with their own value and right to exist. It suggests compartmentalization. He could go through the motions of normal life, going to work, talking to neighbors, posting on social media, while planning and then executing the murder of his family. These psychological traits, narcissistic personality disorder, lack of empathy, ability to compartmentalize, they're not uncommon. Many people have these traits to varying degrees. What's rare is the combination of these traits with the specific circumstances that lead to family annihilation. The affair, the unsustainable double life, the inability to accept divorce as an option, the view of family as property. Understanding this psychology doesn't excuse the behavior, but it might help with prevention. If we can identify people with this psychological profile in high-risk situations, maybe intervention becomes possible. The role of Nikki Kessinger. We need to talk about Nikki Kessinger, the woman Chris Watts was having an affair with. Not because she's responsible for what he did. She's not. The decision to kill his family was Chris's alone. But because her role in this case is significant, and because understanding the affair provides context for his motivations.
When she found out the truth, when she learned he was still living with Shanann and that Shanann was pregnant, she was upset. According to her testimony to police, she told him he needed to be honest, to figure out what he wanted, to make a decision. But she continued the relationship. She continued seeing him, even knowing he had a pregnant wife and 2 young daughters at home. Now, having an affair with a married man, while ethically questionable, is not a crime. It doesn't make someone responsible for what that married man chooses to do.
but it created the context for Chris Watts's actions. He was living a double life. With Shanann and the girls, he was the family man. With Nikki, he was the free, unburdened, exciting partner in a new relationship. He wanted the Nikki life. He didn't want the Shanann life. But he couldn't figure out how to transition from one to the other without consequences he wasn't willing to accept. Divorce meant splitting assets, meant child support, meant shared custody, meant his family and community knowing he'd abandoned his pregnant wife and children, meant Nikki potentially seeing him differently once the reality of his obligations became clear. So instead, he chose murder. Nikki Kessinger cooperated with police. She provided evidence. She testified about their relationship. By all accounts, she was horrified when she learned what Chris had done. But her life has been destroyed too, in a different way. She's had to change her name. She's gone into hiding. She faces public backlash and blame, even though she didn't commit any crime. People have threatened her, harassed her, accused her of being complicit, even though there's no evidence she knew what Chris was planning. Some people have more sympathy for her than others. Some see her as another victim of Chris Watts's manipulation. Others see her as someone who made poor choices in continuing a relationship with a married man and who bears some moral, if not legal, responsibility for the circumstances that led to the murders. I think the truth is that she was manipulated by Chris Watts just like everyone else was. He lied to her. He presented himself as something he wasn't. He made her believe the marriage was already over when it wasn't. But she also made choices that, while not criminal, weren't ethical. She continued the affair even after knowing he was still married. She accepted his version of events without questioning too deeply or setting firmer boundaries. Does that make her responsible for what he did? No, absolutely not. Does it mean we should have compassion for the position she found herself in? I think so.
She didn't kill anyone. She didn't plan anything. She was dating someone who she thought was separated and who turned out to be planning to murder his family. That's a trauma that will stay with her for the rest of her life, knowing that she was part of his motivation, knowing that he was with her while planning to kill his wife and children, knowing that her existence in his life was part of the equation that led to 4 deaths. Media representation and ethics. The Chris Watts case has been covered extensively by media. News reports, documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos, social media discussions. The case has generated enormous interest and enormous content. And that raises ethical questions about how we cover true crime, about what's appropriate, about what serves the public interest versus what's exploitative. I want to address this directly because I'm part of this ecosystem. I'm creating content about this case, and I have a responsibility to do it thoughtfully and ethically. The Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, was particularly significant. It used Shanann's own social media posts, text messages, police footage to tell the story largely through primary sources. It was powerful. It was well done. It centered the victims in a way that much true crime content doesn't. But it also raised questions. Did Shanann's family consent to her social media posts being used this way? Did they have control over how she was represented? Was it appropriate to use her personal videos, things she posted for friends and family, as content in a documentary that millions of people would watch? Netflix and the filmmakers say they worked with the Rzucek family and had their blessing. And the family has spoken positively about the documentary, saying it honors Shanann's memory.
So in that case, it seems the ethical concerns were handled appropriately. But there's a lot of content about this case that isn't as thoughtful. Content that sensationalizes, that focuses on the gruesome details, that treats the tragedy as entertainment rather than as a serious examination of violence and loss. There are YouTube videos with titles designed purely for clicks. There are podcasts that joke about aspects of the case. There are social media posts that trivialize the victims or that express inappropriate fascination with Chris Watts. Where's the line between informing the public and exploiting tragedy? I think about this a lot, and I've tried to establish some principles for myself. First, always center the victims. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. They're why this matters, not Chris, not the details of how he did it, not the true crime entertainment value.
Second, respect the family. If the Rzuceks have asked for something not to be discussed or shared, honor that. They're living with this every day. They get to set boundaries around how their loved one's story is told. Third, focus on understanding and prevention. What can we learn? How can this information potentially save lives? What systemic issues does this case reveal? Fourth, don't sensationalize. Don't focus on gruesome details for shock value. Don't treat this as entertainment. Maintain a serious, respectful tone that acknowledges the weight of what we're discussing. Fifth, be honest about motivations. I'm creating this content partly because it's my job, yes, but also because I believe thorough investigative journalism serves a purpose. I'm trying to balance those motivations ethically. These principles don't make me perfect. I'm sure I fail sometimes. I'm sure there are moments where the line between informing and exploiting gets blurry. But I'm trying, and I think that's all any of us can do when we engage with cases like this. Try to do it thoughtfully. Try to do it ethically. Try to honor the victims while providing information that might be valuable. Let's return to the central question of this investigation. Guards can't protect Chris Watts. What does that actually mean in practical terms? I've spoken with correctional officers about what their job entails and what the limitations are. What guards can do: control physical access. They can ensure that Chris Watts is never in the same physical space as known threats. They can monitor movement through the facility. They can search inmates and cells for weapons. They can intervene when they see physical violence about to occur or occurring. Document threats. When an explicit threat is made, when someone says, "I'm going to kill Chris Watts," guards can document that. They can separate the individuals. They can increase monitoring. They can take formal disciplinary action. Adjust security protocols. If the threat level increases, they can move him to a different cell, add additional guards, change his routine, implement new procedures. What guards can't do: stop communication that happens through subtle means, a gesture, a look, a word that has meaning only in context. These things happen in split seconds. Even guards who are watching carefully might not catch them, and even if they do, they might not understand what they mean. Read minds. If an inmate is planning violence but hasn't made any explicit threats, hasn't shared the plan with others, hasn't taken any visible preparatory steps, guards have no way to know. They can watch behavior and look for patterns, but they can't prevent something they don't know is coming. Provide 24-hour one-on-one monitoring. Resources don't allow for an officer to sit outside Chris Watts' cell watching him every single second. There are scheduled checks, there are cameras, but there are gaps. Eliminate all risk. Even with maximum security measures, even with the best training and resources, violence in prison can't be completely prevented. Not when you have hundreds or thousands of inmates, many with violent histories, in a confined space with limited staff. Guarantee psychological safety.
They can keep him physically separated, but they can't stop him from knowing he's been threatened. They can't prevent the fear. They can't give him peace of mind. And that's the core problem. The Aryan Brotherhood has developed methods that exploit these limitations. They've found ways to communicate threats that are difficult for guards to detect or prevent. They've created psychological pressure that exists independent of any immediate physical danger. And Chris Watts, who spent his entire life controlling his environment and manipulating people, now finds himself in a situation where he controls nothing, and where people more skilled at manipulation than he ever was have made them their target. One officer put it to me bluntly: "We can keep him alive, probably, most likely, but we can't make him feel safe. We can't give him certainty. We can't promise him that one day, when we're understaffed or distracted, or when something else is happening that takes our attention, that someone won't find a way to get to him." And he knows that, and knowing that is its own form of punishment. Is that acceptable? Is that the system working as intended? Those are questions for policymakers, for ethicists, for society as a whole. What I can tell you is that it's the reality right now, in March 2026, at Dodge Correctional Institution. The future. What comes next? So what happens next? Where does this situation go from here? Several possibilities. 1. The Aryan Brotherhood eventually gets to him. Despite all the security measures, despite protective custody, despite guards doing everything they can, someone finds an opportunity. Violence occurs. Chris Watts is injured or killed. This is what many people expect, what some people want, what prison experts say is a very real possibility, given the sophistication and patience of the AB.
2. He lives in this state of fear indefinitely. The AB never follows through with the threats, but they never back off either. Chris Watts spends the next 30, 40, 50 years in isolation, constantly afraid, never feeling safe, psychologically deteriorating, but physically surviving. This might be the most likely outcome, because the AB's power doesn't necessarily come from violence itself. It comes from the threat of violence, from the fear, from demonstrating that they can reach anyone, anywhere. 3. He's moved to a different facility with even higher security, Supermax in Colorado perhaps, where some of the most dangerous inmates in the country are housed, where isolation is even more extreme, but where security is also more sophisticated. This seems unlikely given the resources and coordination it would require, but it's possible if officials decide the current situation is unsustainable. 4. Something breaks in the system. Budget cuts, staffing shortages, overcrowding, some external pressure that reduces the ability to maintain his current level of protection, and in that gap, violence occurs. This is a real concern given the state of American prisons. Resources are limited, staffing is a constant problem, the system is always operating at or beyond capacity. 5. He dies of natural causes before any of this escalates. Health problem, medical emergency, something unrelated to the gang threats. This is always a possibility, though Chris is currently only in his late 30s, so it's probably not the most immediate scenario. 6. Public pressure builds to the point where officials implement new protections or move him despite the challenges. Media attention on the threats leads to accountability. Resources are allocated. The situation changes. This could happen if there's enough outcry, if people demand that the system actually protect inmates, regardless of what they've done. I don't know which of these will occur. I don't even know which should occur. What I do know is that Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never be free. He will never experience normal human life again.
Whether he spends that time in relative safety or in constant fear, whether he lives to old age or whether the AB eventually reaches him, whether the system protects him or fails him, those questions remain open. And in the meantime, the Rzucek family continues to grieve, continues to live without Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, continues to carry a loss that time doesn't heal. That's the real tragedy, not what happens to Chris Watts, but what happened to them.
Lessons for the public. As we move toward the end of this investigation, I want to talk about what the public can learn from all of this, because these cases shouldn't just be content we consume. They should teach us something. They should change how we see the world and how we protect ourselves and the people we love. Lesson 1. Trust your instincts. Shanann knew something was wrong. Her friends knew something felt off, but there was no concrete evidence, no proof, nothing you could point to and say, this is dangerous. But the feeling was there, and it was correct. If something feels wrong in your relationship, if someone's behavior changes in ways that concern you, if you have a gut feeling that you're not safe, even if you can't articulate why, trust that. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't minimize it. Don't wait for proof. Your instincts are trying to protect you. Listen to them. Lesson 2. Emotional abuse is abuse. Chris Watts wasn't physically violent before he killed his family, but he was emotionally manipulative. He was lying. He was gaslighting. He was creating a false reality. Emotional abuse is real abuse. It's not less serious because there are no physical marks. It's often a precursor to physical violence, and it's harmful in its own right. If someone is controlling, if they lie consistently, if they make you question your own perception of reality, if they isolate you from friends and family, those are serious warning signs. Take them seriously. Lesson 4. Understand that danger can look normal. Chris Watts looked like every other suburban dad. He seemed nice, friendly, calm, unremarkable. Danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks exactly like normalcy. Don't assume that because someone seems nice or because they've never been violent before, that they're not capable of harm. Most people who commit extreme violence weren't violent every day of their lives leading up to it. Pay attention to patterns, to changes, to subtle signs that something isn't right. And lesson 4, the system won't always protect you. Shanann could have reported that her husband was having an affair. She could have told police she was worried about her marriage. She could have sought help. But what would they have done? He hadn't committed any crime. He hadn't made any threats. There was no legal basis for intervention. The system is reactive. It responds to crimes that have already occurred. It doesn't prevent them.
So you have to protect yourself. You have to make hard choices. You have to leave situations that feel unsafe, even if you can't prove they're unsafe. Don't wait for the system to save you. Save yourself. Lesson 5. Document everything. Shanann's text messages, her videos, her social media posts, they became crucial evidence. They showed the timeline. They showed what she knew and when. They showed who Chris really was versus who he pretended to be. If you're in a situation that concerns you, document it. Save texts. Record conversations if it's legal in your state. Keep a journal. Tell friends what's happening. That documentation might save your life. It might be the evidence that proves what you are experiencing. It might be what leads to justice if something happens.
Lesson 6. Know the warning signs of family annihilation. We talked about the psychology earlier. Now let's make it practical. Warning signs include sudden affair or new relationship when previously faithful, extreme financial stress combined with refusal to seek help or adjust lifestyle, talking about feeling trapped with no way out, emotional detachment from children or family, increased interest in appearance and changes to personal presentation, secretiveness about phone, computer, whereabouts, personality changes that seem out of character, expressing that family is an obstacle or burden, making unusual financial decisions like increasing life insurance, showing interest in weapons or methods of harm when they haven't before. None of these alone means someone will commit family annihilation. Most people who experience these things won't become violent. But if you see multiple signs, if the pattern is concerning, if your instincts are telling you something is very wrong, get out. Get your children out. Don't wait. Don't give them the opportunity.
The Watts case shows what can happen when warning signs are missed or when someone stays in a dangerous situation. But there are thousands of cases where people saw the signs and left. And nothing terrible happened because they removed themselves from danger before it escalated. Those cases don't make the news. They don't become documentaries, but they matter just as much. Your survival matters. Your choice to leave matters. Your instinct to protect yourself and your children matters. Don't second-guess yourself. Don't wonder if you overreacted. You did what you needed to do, and you're here because of it. And if you're currently in a situation that scares you, that doesn't feel right, that makes you worry about your safety or your children's safety, please hear this. You don't need proof. You don't need evidence. You don't need to convince anyone else that the danger is real. If you feel unsafe, if your instincts are screaming at you, if something deep inside is telling you to get out, listen to that. Act on it. Leave. Practical steps. Make a safety plan. Figure out where you can go, who can help you, what resources are available. Document everything. Save texts, emails, any evidence of concerning behavior. Tell someone you trust what's happening. Don't keep it secret. Contact domestic violence resources. They can help you plan and provide support. Trust that leaving is possible. It might be hard, it might be complicated, but it's possible, and it's worth it. Your life has value. Your children's lives have value. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be believed. You deserve help. Reach out, get support, make a plan, and when you're ready, leave. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. They're available 24/7. They can help you figure out what to do next. You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to figure it all out yourself. There are people who want to help. Let them.
Final thoughts on justice and punishment. We're near the end now, and I want to return to some of the bigger questions this case raises. Questions about justice, about punishment, about what we owe to victims and what we owe to perpetrators. Chris Watts is serving 5 life sentences plus 84 years. He will never be released. He will die in prison. Is that enough? Is that justice for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico? I don't know.
I genuinely don't know if any punishment could be enough for what he did. No sentence will bring them back. No amount of suffering on his part will undo their deaths. No prison term, no matter how long, will heal the Rzucek family's grief. So what is justice in a case like this? Is it revenge? Is it making the perpetrators suffer as much as possible? Is it ensuring they never experience joy or comfort or peace for as long as they live? Is it protection? Is it removing someone dangerous from society so they can never harm anyone else? Is it rehabilitation? Is it attempting to change someone into a better person, even though they'll never be released, even though it won't undo what they've done? Is it remembrance? Is it keeping the victims' stories alive, making sure they're not forgotten, using the tragedy to educate and prevent future harm? I think it's probably all of these things and more. Justice is complicated. It's not one thing. It's not simple. Chris Watts is being punished, severely. He's lost his freedom forever. He lives in a small cell. He's isolated. He's afraid. He faces threats from dangerous people. His reputation is destroyed. His name is synonymous with evil. His family has been torn apart. That's punishment, real, significant, ongoing punishment. Is it proportional to what he did? Can any punishment be proportional to ending 4 innocent lives? These are philosophical questions that don't have definitive answers. What I can say is this: the legal system did its job. He was investigated, arrested, charged, and sentenced according to law. He received life in prison, the maximum sentence available in Wisconsin. The correction system is attempting to do its job, though with limitations. They're trying to keep him safe while he serves his sentence. They're failing in some ways, but they're trying. The public has rendered its judgment. Chris Watts is almost universally reviled. His crime has become a cultural reference point. His case is studied and discussed. His victims are remembered. Is that enough? It has to be, because it's all we have. It's all the system can provide. And for the Rzucek family, I suspect no amount of punishment would ever feel like enough, because nothing will bring back the people they lost. Nothing will fill the hole left by Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico's absence. So maybe the question shouldn't be, is this justice enough? Maybe the question should be, what do we do with this tragedy? Do we let it change us? Do we let it teach us? Do we let it make us more aware, more careful, more protective of vulnerable people?
Do we honor the victims by telling their stories, by using their tragedy to prevent future tragedies, by keeping their memory alive not just as victims, but as people who lived and loved and mattered? I think that's what justice looks like in a case like this. Not just punishment for the perpetrator, but honoring the victims, learning from the tragedy, using it to make the world marginally safer, marginally better. That's the best we can do, and we have to believe it means something. We've covered a lot of ground in this investigation. The threats Chris Watts is facing, the new methods the Aryan Brotherhood has developed, the failure of protective custody to provide true safety, the psychological toll of isolation and fear, the broader systemic issues this case reveals. But more importantly, we've talked about Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and Nico Watts. 4 people who deserved to live, who deserved to be here right now in March 2026, who were taken from this world by someone who should have protected them. That's what matters most, not what happens to Chris Watts, not whether he's safe or afraid or comfortable or suffering, but remembering them,
honoring them, learning from their tragedy. If you take one thing from this investigation, let it be this. Pay attention to warning signs. Trust your instincts. Don't ignore red flags. Protect yourself and the people you love. Don't wait for proof before taking action to ensure safety. Shanann's friends saw changes in Chris. She herself felt that something was wrong, but no one could have predicted that he was capable of what he did. No one could have imagined that the friendly dad next door was planning to destroy his family. So we can't always predict violence. We can't always see it coming, but we can be aware. We can be careful. We can trust ourselves when something feels off. We can leave situations that don't feel safe. We can speak up when we're concerned about someone we love. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness will save a life. That caution will prevent a tragedy. That willingness to trust instincts will get someone out before it's too late. That would honor Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. That would mean their story mattered. That would mean we learned something from their deaths that makes us better, safer, more protective of each other. As for Chris Watts, he's where he belongs, behind bars, for life, facing consequences for what he did. Whether the Aryan Brotherhood eventually gets to him, whether he lives in fear for decades, whether the prison system protects him or fails him, those outcomes are beyond our control. What's in our control is how we respond to this case, what we learn from it, how we use it to protect others. So I'll close with this. Remember their names: Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and Nico Watts. Not his name, theirs. Not how they died, who they were. Not the horror of what happened, the love they deserved and should have received. They mattered. Their lives had value. Their deaths were a tragedy that should never have happened. And we honor them by making sure we learn, by making sure we're aware, by making sure that when we see the warning signs, when our instincts tell us something is wrong, we act. We protect ourselves, we protect our children, we protect each other. That's how we honor victims of violence, not just by seeking punishment for perpetrators, but by doing everything in our power to prevent the next tragedy. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. If this investigation helped you understand this case more completely, if it taught you something about recognizing danger, if it made you think about justice and punishment and what we owe to victims, please share it. Let others learn from it too. And subscribe to support this kind of thorough, victim-centered investigative journalism. Because these stories need to be told. These lessons need to be shared. These victims need to be remembered. Until next time, stay safe, trust yourself, protect the people you love. And never forget, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico deserved better. They deserved to live. They deserved love and safety and futures full of possibility. May they rest in peace, and may we do better, be better, protect better, because they deserved that, and so does everyone else who's vulnerable, who's afraid, who's in danger. We can't save everyone. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can try, and sometimes trying is enough to make a difference. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember this, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that. Act on it. Your life or someone else's life might depend on it. Thank you.